Right. So let's dive into the evolving dynamics between Ukraine and the UK, especially since the Labour government took over in July. I see what you're saying here. Things between Kyiv and London have become a bit more strained recently. Ukraine's officials are feeling disappointed because the UK hasn't stepped up with additional long-range missiles, which are crucial for their defensive efforts. These are specifically the Storm Shadow missiles, a high-precision weapon that Ukraine has effectively used in the past against Russian targets, particularly in Crimea. Okay, let's break it down further. Since Keir Starmer came into office, there's this sense that support from the UK has become more hesitant, at least from Ukraine's perspective. Now, it's not that Britain has completely turned its back, but Ukraine's looking for stronger assurances, especially since Donald Trump's recent election win has thrown their support from the US into question. So they're under real pressure. British missiles could make a huge difference right now, and Kyiv feels that without them, they're left exposed at a critical time. Yeah, Ukrainian officials are clear that they don't want Starmer to visit unless he's ready to bring serious support with him, specifically more of those Storm Shadow missiles. They've said that a visit without this would feel symbolic, at best more like a tourist trip. This frustration is particularly sharp because Russia is gaining ground in the east, the front lines are shifting, and Ukrainian forces are facing intense pressure from Russian troops, who, by the way, are reportedly better supplied and equipped. So here's the thing: Sunak, Starmer's predecessor, had a relatively supportive relationship with Ukraine. He visited Kyiv shortly after taking office, following in the footsteps of Boris Johnson, who had been a solid ally for Ukraine since the Russian invasion started in February 2022. Both leaders took a more proactive stance, which clearly resonates with Ukraine as they reflect on the changes in support. I mean, even when Sunak was in office, Britain was among the first to pledge support, and it wasn't just rhetoric. They sent military aid and financial backing worth billions, a fact that Ukraine hasn't forgotten. But things feel different now. Starmer recently met with President Zelensky at a summit in Budapest, and he did express a commitment to stand with Ukraine, yet Ukrainian officials left that meeting feeling disappointed, claiming there was no progress at all on the missile front. Zelensky's victory plan, which outlines Ukraine's strategic goals, including a potential NATO membership, more military aid, and increased economic support, didn't seem to resonate as much with Starmer. At least, that's how the Ukrainians perceived it, and they even suggested that Starmer seems reluctant to make independent decisions without aligning first with Washington. This hesitation from Starmer might have a lot to do with the fact that the U.S. government, especially under the Biden administration, has been a massive contributor to Ukraine's defense. And with Trump potentially shifting the U.S. stance on Ukraine, there's even more at stake for Kyiv. See, under Biden, the U.S. still has about $6 billion set aside in unallocated security funds to support Ukraine, which might get them through 2025. But Trump's victory could mean a shift in U.S. policy, possibly pushing for a peace deal or at least a ceasefire with Russia, something that doesn't align with Ukraine's goal of reclaiming lost territory. Yeah, I can see why Ukraine is frustrated. The UK was one of the top 3 military backers right after the US, and Germany, contributing billions in various forms of aid, from military equipment to humanitarian assistance. Yet now, that level of proactive support seems to be fading. And another layer to this is the appointment of Jonathan Powell, Tony Blair's former chief of staff, as the UK's national security advisor. Powell is known for his belief in negotiating with adversaries to achieve peace, so his influence could potentially steer the UK toward advocating for negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, a stance that, from Ukraine's perspective, might feel premature given the ongoing hostilities. You know, for Ukraine, it's not just about symbolic statements. They're looking for concrete action, especially when it comes to military support. The issue of using Storm Shadow missiles against targets within Russia is another sticking point. Ukraine has requested that the UK lift restrictions on using these missiles to hit Russian sites further afield, not just in Crimea but in other occupied territories as well. The UK, it seems, hasn't agreed to this, possibly because Washington doesn't favor such strikes, worried it could escalate tensions further. I see where Zelensky is coming from, given that he's also dealing with the impact of intensifying Russian missile strikes across Ukraine. Recently, Russia increased its attacks using Iranian-made Shahed drones and ballistic missiles, which have done significant damage to Ukraine's infrastructure, including their energy systems, right as they face the harsh winter season. Kyiv has seen near-nightly air raid alerts, and the threat has grown especially severe. Adding to Ukraine's worries is the presence of North Korean soldiers reportedly preparing to join Russia in combat operations, which Zelensky addressed in a social media post. He pointed out how allies like the US, UK, and Germany have essentially been passive as North Korea becomes increasingly involved. Alright, it's a tough situation, especially since the UK's previous leaders were quick to show up, meet with Zelensky, and make concrete contributions to Ukraine's war effort. Starmer's delayed visit and apparent reluctance to provide more Storm Shadow missiles only emphasize the shift in British policy. To Ukraine, this is troubling because they don't feel they're being heard, and their need for support, especially in terms of advanced weaponry, is urgent. Ultimately, it looks like Ukraine feels that the UK, under Labour leadership, isn't aligning with them as closely as before, and this is happening when Trump's presidency could mean a reduction in American support. With the Kremlin ramping up attacks and the Ukrainian military feeling outgunned, it's easy to see why Kyiv is anxious for a more decisive stance from Starmer. They're in a place where they need strong allies to stay resilient against Russia's advances, and any hint that support is wavering feels like a major setback.